Welcome back to Classic Gaming Quarterly TV. In this episode, we take a look at the latest product in the Everdrive line. This is the Everdrive GB for the Nintendo Game Boy and Game Boy Color line of systems. This product just came out within the last couple months, and in fact, I just got mine in the mail yesterday. It's compatible with any system that'll play Game Boy or Game Boy Color games, including the original Game Boy, the Game Boy Pocket, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance SP, and the Game Boy Player for the GameCube. It won't work with the Game Boy Micro or any of the Nintendo DS systems because they lack the proper backwards compatibility. Luckily for me, it also works with the Super Game Boy for the Super Nintendo, which is my preferred method of playing Game Boy games and also how I'm recording the footage for today's video. I'll also quickly show off this new controller I just picked up. This is the Super Game Boy Commander from Hori, which is a Japanese-only controller that's obviously stylized to look like the old Game Boy. I've been looking for one for about 10 years, so I was really happy to find it. And before we get into the Everdrive, I just want to quickly mention that Classic Gaming Quarterly is now on Twitter, and you can find us at CG Quarterly if you're into that sort of thing. So let's take a look at the Everdrive GB. Okay, I'll try to go over this as quickly as I can so I don't bore anybody. When you first turn on your Everdrive, you are greeted with the contents of your root directory, which, as you can see here, is EDGB, GB, and GBC. So those are all folders. And the important one there is EDGB, which is the system folder of the Everdrive. That's got all of its system files. And if you buy an Everdrive without an SD card and supply your own, you will need to go to the developer's website and download that EDGB folder and put it in the root directory of your micro SD card. So just to go over the controls really quickly, up and down on the D-pad moves up and down. Left and right is page up and page down. The B button is your OK or select button. The A button is back. The start button will immediately launch whatever game is already resident in memory. And the select button brings up the main menu. In the main menu, you have options, none of which I recommend you ever change unless somebody tells you to in order to be compatible with some certain game. Cheats is where you would type in Game Genie cheat codes. So you would go load whatever game you wanted to play, but instead of hitting load and run, you would just hit load, and then you can come back in here and put in some Game Genie cheat codes. Device info is really, in my opinion, only useful in that it tells you what OS version you're running. So if a newer OS gets released, then you will know that yours is outdated. So if you see that there's an OS version 3 on Igor's website and you come here and see that you have version 1, then you should download the new OS because maybe it has some cool new features that you don't even know about. And lastly, you have About, which has the support email and web page. Those are just Igor's email and his website. And it also gives you a quick rundown on the controls needed to navigate the Everdrive's menu system. So I'm going to go all the way back here. Once again, we're in the root directory of the SD card. So now if I want to launch a Game Boy game, I'm going to go to GB. And this is only the way I have the ROMs set up on this card. You can set them up any way you like. I have them split up into Game Boy and Game Boy Color. So I'm going to go into Game Boy, and then let's say I want to play Super Mario Land. So I have to go into World, because again, I have mine organized by region. That doesn't mean that you have to do it that way. So I'm going to go down to Super Mario Land. I'm going to hit B. That brings up the file menu, and then I'm going to go ahead and load and start, because I'm not going to use any cheat codes. So after a minute, there is Super Mario Land. And this is one of my favorite Game Boy games because I got my Game Boy in December of '89. I got it for Christmas, and that was the first Christmas that it was available here in the United States. And so I've just got a lot of nostalgic feeling tied up into this game. A lot of people don't like this game because it's pretty primitive and it's a lot different than other Mario games. And some people may not realize that is because this game was designed by Gunpei Yokoi. Oh my goodness. That game was designed by Gunpei Yokoi instead of Shigeru Miyamoto. So that's why it's a little bit of a different game. Anyway, let's say I now want to stop playing Super Mario Land and play something else. Well, unfortunately, there's no magic key combination I can put in that'll take me back out to the menu. And of course, Game Boys don't have reset buttons. Although if I hit reset on my Super Nintendo, all it's going to do is reset Super Mario Land. So I actually have to power cycle my system and just go through the process all over again. So the other thing we'll look at is Game Boy Color, just to show you that you can run Game Boy Color games. Now, because I'm using a Super Game Boy, I cannot run Game Boy Color only games. I can only run games that are Game Boy Color but also original Game Boy compatible, like Tetris DX. Now, if you are playing or using your Everdrive on a Game Boy Color or on a Game Boy Advance or on a Game Boy Player for GameCube, then you can play any game you want, including Game Boy Color only games, and they'll be fully colorized. But since I'm playing on a Super Game Boy, which is really only an original Game Boy, guts shoved into a oversized Super Nintendo cartridge, I can only play games that are compatible with an original Game Boy. So, and it actually saved my game from the last time I was playing. That's interesting. So you can see that even though this is a Game Boy Color game, it's not really in color because I'm not playing on a Game Boy Color. What we have here instead is, fake Super Game Boy colorization. Although I will point out that the custom border that it's using looks really cool. And I know this is not a video about Super Game Boy, but there are a lot of Game Boy games that have built into them custom Super Game Boy borders, and they look pretty neat. And if you don't have a Super Game Boy, but you do have a Super Nintendo, then I would totally recommend that you buy one of these things because they're pretty awesome. So I don't really know what else to say about the Everdrive, except that it's yet another great product from Igor, and maybe more so than the home console Everdrives. This is really useful because if you're using your Game Boy as it was intended, in that you're traveling with it, or you're using it, maybe you commute to work on the train or the bus and you're playing Game Boy, or maybe like me, you travel a lot for work and you take a game system with you. Right now, I grab my SP and just put a whole stack of Game Boy games in my luggage so that I have a variety of things to play. And now I'm not going to have to do that anymore because I'm just going to grab my SP and then grab this Everdrive and I'm going to be good to go. So I really can't recommend this highly enough, and that really goes for any of the Everdrive products. I think they're all great products, and this Igor guy was really he's really filling a need in the community that wasn't there before, and I'm surprised it took this long. But I'll put a link in the video comments or in the video description with a link to Igor's website, his storefront website, so you can buy one of these for yourself if you want. That's how I would recommend that you do it, because then Igor is getting 100% of the profits. If you go through a middleman, then Igor is not making as much money. So it's like buying produce from a farmer's market instead of the grocery store. You should buy an Everdrive from the Everdrive Farmer's Market. So I'll put that link in the comments. Thanks again for watching, and we will see you next time. That's it for this episode, but be sure to check us out on Twitter @CG Quarterly, or look for Classic Gaming Quarterly on Facebook. And if you've never been there before, check out our website at cgquarterly.com.